Good morning, all.
Good morning.
How's everybody's morning going?
Pretty good. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good.
I hope everyone's morning is better than mine. My car wouldn't start this morning when I went to take my daughter to daycare. It was just,
Oh no.
but I was like, how do I get her there? And luckily our neighbor was home and they have a car seat for their granddaughter. So it worked out. But I was like, I know this is a big ask in a pandemic. And she's like, no problem, we're good.
Aw.
So, yeah, interesting start. Let's woke me up. Let's just say that. Like insanely easy to take attendance since you all have your names right up there. I've never had this such an easy time before. It's nice.
Macy, were you at TCC with me?
I was.
Okay, I thought that was you.
Yeah, I think we had a few psychology classes together.
Yeah.
I've been teaching in our online program too in the summers, and not this past time, but the time before, there were two students who were like, wait, we had a class together last mini session, and they like bonded right away. It was great. Double checking my email to make sure no one's having tech issues. Apparently, like most of campus couldn't access Zoom on Monday, so we lucked out and everything was fine. Just like knock wood. Okie dokie, it's 10, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know other people will roll in, but I'm going to try to always respect your time and go ahead and get started on time. So before we dive into our first lecture, exciting, I wanted to take a minute like I promised on Monday and show you how I take notes when I am doing stuff on Zoom. So what I typically do is I make my Zoom like half the screen, and then the other half I'll have a Word document open. Obviously, if you prefer to take notes handwritten, it's even easier, right? But this is how I do it. So I'm gonna share my screen with you so you can see a couple examples here. Yep. Sure, I'm sharing the right one here. So, and these are from a conference I went to over the summer. So this one was way more copying and pasting than I typically do, but this is one that had a lot of diagrams, and it's obviously really hard to replicate those. So I did a lot of copying and pasting of the slides they were showing to show the diagrams. This was a really cool press conference they did, where they actually looked at the economic cost of eating disorders, which is like sad, we shouldn't have to, right? But like that's a way to get people realizing, oh, we should actually do something about this. So you can see how like I copy pasted things, but then I'll take notes underneath and like Q&As, things like that. And then I'll show you another example. This was from the same conference, but a different session that it was less diagram heavy. So it was mostly just me taking my normal notes. I like to use bullets even when I hand take notes. But then I had done some screen grabs. Now, I'm not actually sure the best way to do this on a Mac, although Mac users probably know yourselves. But on Windows, the way that I do my screen grabs is, and I have this pinned since I use it so often, is I use Snip and Sketch. Such a weird name, but it works. And then you just tell it like, hey, I want to do a new one. And you just choose wherever you want to select on the screen, and then it will save it for you as an image. You can copy it and paste it into your Word doc. Or if for some reason you wanted to save this image itself, so the image I have on Blackboard of the norms, the group norms, I snipped that from the presentation I was in on Friday and just saved it as a picture because I knew I'd want to use it for all my classes. Just my tips, but you'll figure out what works the best for you, I'm sure. So we're going to dive into our first lecture. Let me stop sharing this part of the screen. So I'm going to be in sort of full screen mode for PowerPoint. But I want you all to definitely feel like you can ask questions. So feel free to type them in the chat, use the raised hands feature. And then, if I miss it, just unmute yourself and be like, hey, Dr. Myers. I caught myself a music stand to sort of approximate a podium because I usually stand when I lecture. So I'm feeling like I'll be more engaging with you all if I can do that. So I am going to stand over there, and that will make seeing you all a little bit harder, but I'm going to try to make this work as much as I can. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and again, the PowerPoints and PDFs of the PowerPoints are on our Blackboard page if you want to use those to follow along. And actually, real quick before I do that, I am just going to finish up my attendance and give everybody credit for being here today. Awesome. Okay. Let me get us, so I can see more of you on the screen here. So that will help as well. Get up the participants and get up the chat so I can see everything here. Yeah, I think that'll work. Okay. Yeah, it's a brave new world for all of us, right? We're just gonna all figure out the best new approximation of doing things. And I've got to not put the music stand on Simba, who is sleeping at my feet right now. So, again, a little awkward, but better than me just sitting and talking to you. I can be a little more engaging. here. So today we're going to start talking about what is personality. And this is the first chapter of your book. I know several of you contacted me saying the bookstore is being slow because they have to do everybody's orders online, right? So I don't usually like to say this, but for this class, it's okay if you read this first chapter a little bit later. Basically, I'll be covering what I want you to know from the chapter in general, and then when we get to the tests, I'll let you know if there's anything I don't cover in class that is going to be on the test. I give you all review sheets. So basically, it's okay. Whenever you get your book, just read the first chapter. All right. And then hopefully this will work. Oh, wait, I have to actually re-click on the screen. Ah, yay, using all the technology. All right, so I actually used a sampling of your definitions that you wrote for our poll that you took on Monday. So thanks to everyone for filling that out. And I really liked the broad range that we got here. So the makeup of a person's mind might be how we define personality, how someone interacts with their environment and with others, a group of somewhat stable individual traits that accompany the person throughout their lives, how someone interacts with their environment and with others, or a set of traits and characteristics determined in part by genetics, environment, upbringing, and other factors that define an individual and their perspective, actions, behaviors, and ideas. So I always ask this at the start of this class, and what I love about it is that you all end up sort of approximating different theoretical perspectives with your definitions, sort of without trying to. And this is also just a really nice way to introduce the fact that there's not really one agreed upon definition of personality in the field, to be honest. So one of the things, for those of you who have taken other psych classes, you might have discovered is psychologists like to use the same, like different words to mean the same things, right? We like to come up with our own terms, and we'll see that throughout the semester. And it's true for definitions as well. So how do we define personality? I think I've talked to some of you about how this ends up being more of a philosophy of psychology class at some points. And this is an example of when we're gonna get into that point. So how do we define any word, right? So for example, bird, how would you define this word? And just go ahead and unmute yourself and shout out a definition.
A flying animal.
A flying animal, great. What else?
It lays eggs and is warm-blooded.
Lays eggs, warm-blooded, good. Other defining features of a bird?
So it's a creature.
It's
that
not a
has
bat.
Wings.
It's not a bat, but it does have wings. So that's a really good point here.
That lays eggs.
The birds have wings, but as someone just pointed out, I think about it, Miranda, bats also have wings, right? And they're mammals, not birds. And in the words of my undergraduate professor, Michael Levine, who taught me this class as an undergrad, so if we say birds have wings, so maxi pads are birds, right? Some of them have wings. So, you know, we have to be pretty precise with our language. And what we'll find is different theorists are more precise than others. That certainly happens. So we want to think about the essence of birdidity, and we want to think about that for all the terms we're going to think about. Like, what is the essence of this term? What does it actually mean? And what's the point? Why bother? Why should we do this? Well, the point is to think about complexity. What are we trying to explain? And again, here's where we're thinking about things really philosophically. The word personality is difficult to define and challenging to study and research. Just as the concepts we'll be talking about all semester can be difficult to define, study, and research. We will see how the same ideas are explained in a vast number of ways, and the same ideas, some theorists will be like, well, of course, we measure it this way, and other theorists will be like, we shouldn't even be trying to measure things. We'll read an article about that later in the semester. So a brief aside, I just mentioned Michael Levine, and we're going to spend much of this course discussing psychologists who are defined as great psychologists. And as I mentioned in my email to you all last week and on Monday, a lot of them are old white guys, right? And so it's like, who gets to decide who's a great psychologist? That's part of the issue. But I want to spend a couple minutes introducing you to two more great psychologists who have influenced my own views of personality psychology. And of course, they are both white men as well. That is the majority of the professors I have had. And I was always very grateful when I got different perspectives, put it that way. So Michael Levine is an undergraduate. He was my undergraduate personality professor. He was also my informal advisor, and kind of like still is to this day. When I was interviewing for jobs, when I got the job at Wesleyan, he was one of the calls I made to get some advice on interviewing. He researches the prevention of body dissatisfaction and eating disorders. He's retired now, but he's one of those people who doesn't understand what being retired means, so he just keeps going. And he began his work as a psychologist studying type A personality, and then sort of fell into the eating disorders work. So you'll hear me mention particularly him a lot throughout the semester, just because he had a lot of great Levine-isms. I actually still have my undergraduate notebook where I took notes on his class, and it's just filled with like quotes from him. He will be mentioned quite a bit. And then Ben Newberry is the bottom picture. He taught me my graduate course in personality, and he also taught me how to teach. So in graduate school, we were lucky enough to have a class on college teaching. Not everybody gets that. And Ben actually taught us that, which was great. He came in and he watched us the first time we taught and gave us feedback and made us record ourselves. And like to this day, that was in 2006, I've never listened to that tape because I was like, don't want to see it, don't want to know. But his feedback was really helpful. And he studied stress and health as well as behaviorism. And I think sometimes in order to teach this class, you kind of have to have a big personality, and both of these guys did. So I will reference them when I make certain analogies. So for example, Newberry is where I got my analogy that the id in Freud's theory is like Cookie Monster. All right, so here are just some of the definitions of personality we'll run into throughout the semester. And these are sort of paraphrased, but you could start to see the level of disagreement within psychology by looking at these. So Freud said personality is largely unconscious, hidden, and unknown. And Skinner said it's unnecessary. Skinner believed the mind was sort of this black box, and all we needed to look at was observable behavior. Allport said it's something real within an individual that leads to characteristic behavior and thought. So a quote from Allport, and you certainly don't have to try to write this down, but just to give you an idea of how psychologists talk about these things. Personality is the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his or her characteristic behavior and thought. Right? Psychologists tend to be very, very wordy. And sometimes I think this is to our detriment. When I write, I try purposely not to write like this. So actually, Michael Levine was the editor for a chapter I wrote for an edited book. And he was like, yours is the same length as everybody else's, but somehow you have many more words. And it's like, yeah, because I'm not using like all 4-syllable words when I don't need to. But that's, again, just a personal thing. And other psychologists feel like we need to use this type of language. Other definitions of personality, it comes from the Greek persona, which means mask. So this idea that the personality might be a mask that we wear. And then Funder, who is your textbook's author, and this is actually a picture of him. I'm going to try to show you all pictures of the authors of our readings throughout the semester, just again, so we can try to see some of the diversity that may or may not exist. So Funder said it's an individual's characteristic patterns of thoughts, emotion, and behavior, together with the psychological mechanisms hidden or not behind those patterns. And what I really like about Funder's definitions is a lot of your definitions dovetail with his, right? So his way of thinking about it fits with what makes sense to a lot of us. So we've talked about personality. Again, we are nowhere near actually deciding how to define it, right? But we'll talk about that throughout the semester. So next we got to talk about the other half of the title of this class, right? What is a theory and who the heck cares? Why do we need to talk about theories at all? Well, theories, as we'll discuss them in this class, are grounded in the scientific enterprise. That means they attempt to understand things according to a particular set of rules and based on systematic objective observation. So I'll say that again, because again, wordy. So they're means to try to understand things according to a particular set of rules and based on systematic objective observation. And this is opposed to just go ask the Dalai Lama, right? Or insert your religious figure or great thinker here, right? So in psychology, psychology is a science. In fact, in our department, if you've taken our intro class, we use a text called The Science of Psychology. In psychology, we try to look at things from a scientific perspective. Psychology is really interesting because we sort of straddle the line between social sciences like political science and sociology and natural sciences like biology and chemistry. And in fact, where I was an undergrad, psychology was actually housed in the Department of Natural Sciences. And that was partially because we had a lot more brain-based researchers than we do at Virginia Wesleyan, but also sort of a recognition of the scientific basis of the way we examine things. So in everyday life, we use the word theory in a really different way than we use it scientifically. So again, just sort of shout out definitions here. So in everyday life, how do we think of a theory? Like if you said, I have a theory about that, what would you mean?
Usually it's just considered like an idea.
Exactly. Yeah, any other thoughts about it?
It's an idea of how something is, why it is the way that it is.
Yeah, it answers a question that you ask, like, why is the sky blue? And then you come up with a theory and try to figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so in everyday life, it's like a sort of an idea, maybe even unfounded speculation, right? Like my theory about that is. And sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's that 5G is causing COVID, right? Which is obviously not true. Hopefully you all know that. But in science, it's a proposed explanatory system. A proposed explanatory system. So a theory is a way of explaining the world. So the easiest way to think about this is like the theory of evolution, right? It's a way of explaining how things have adapted over time. It can be spectacular, a theory. It can be sort of all-encompassing and trying to explain everything about everything. Or it can be really focused. It doesn't have to be overarching. And even those really focused theories can end up being really helpful and drive future research. That's really what ends up happening with theories in the scientific world, is that you have a theory and you base future research upon it. So a theory is based on constructs. It's basically a set of constructs held together by a set of statements. So a set of constructs held together by a set of statements. So what is a construct? So I did the like high school thing. I rarely do, but I think here it's helpful to have a Merriam-Webster definition. So it's something constructed by the mind, a little circular, right? A theoretical entity, a working hypothesis or concept, the product of ideology, history, or social circumstances. So really, concept is, for me, the best definition of construct. A construct is just a fancy way of saying a concept. So theories in psychology are like those in other disciplines, like math, physics, biology, where they entail essentially a set of rules that tries to explain how things work. And here it's just, we're trying to explain how people work, which gets more and more complicated, right? So Pervin has a definition here, a set of assumptions and explanatory concepts that tie together various empirical findings, so research findings, and suggest new relationships among them that should obtain under certain defined circumstances. So essentially, based on research, if X happens, Y will be the result. So we're going to talk about a lot of different theories. I mean, theories of personality is our class title, right? So how can we decide which theory to use? So there's two overall approaches to describe personality theories. There is, and this is by a psychologist named Maddie. We'll talk about him a little bit later in the semester when we talk about existentialism. But he said there's two overall approaches to describe personality theories. He called it benevolent eclecticism and partisan zealotry. So benevolent eclecticism is sort of like, every theory is pretty good. They all contribute to our general knowledge base. Cool. Partisan zealotry is what we typically see from the people who come up with the theory, and then their most ardent supporters. So this is, my theory is right, everybody else is wrong. I don't know if anyone watches the Try Guys on YouTube, but this is Eugene's Rank King. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. Right, that's partisan zealotry. You tout your own preferred theory and you put down all the rest. And I've seen evidence of both of these in psychologists who are very preeminent in the field. So for example, one panel I went to at a conference had people from 3 different leading theories of therapy. And 2 of the people were saying, yeah, like all these things work really well. And then one guy was like, no, mine works so much better. That's partisan zealotry. Okay? And then Newberry, my graduate professor, said, yes, those 2 things, but you can also have malevolent eclecticism. And this is where you take the theories as scientific theories and you can examine what they offer about human psychology. Essentially, it's critical thinking about the theory. So rather than just being like, they're all good, what we sometimes call in psychology the dodo bird hypothesis from Alice in Wonderland, where the dodo bird says, all have won and all deserve prizes. This says, let's think critically about what's good and what's not. And again, Thunder really does that well in your book. So, okay, we have maybe some criteria trying to decide how to use a theory, but we should also probably try to evaluate whether the theories are actually good or not, right? So what makes a good theory? So there are different people who have different ideas about this. So Pervin, back in 1989, came up with several concepts that he said could help you define what makes a good theory. So one was parsimony. So he said, there's elegance in simplicity and directness. Essentially, try to say something as simply as you can. Some of the theories we'll talk about this semester have that, and some almost purposely don't. So again, if you're using that as a criteria, perhaps that's a good thing to do, but we'll talk about whether or not that's even a good thing for a theory trying to describe all of human behavior, right? Then there's comprehensiveness. So trying to explain as much as possible about personality. And certainly, especially the early theories we're going to talk about, like Freud, this was the goal. Like, we're going to describe not only all of personality, but all of development and all of mental disorders and essentially everything all in one theory. And you can see already how like 1 and 2, right, might be in conflict with each other. Like, how can you describe everything parsimoniously? It's tricky, right? Then there's syntax, the clarity and logic of the relationships between propositions and the constructs. Like, does it make sense, essentially, is what syntax is, right? Is it pretty comprehensible, or does it sound like you're talking to Yoda, where it's like, what idea this is? Then there's semantics. So this is the ease with which abstract ideas and constructs are operationalized into observable behaviors. So I have an idea, how am I actually going to observe whether a person is doing that or not? That's semantics in the psychological sense. A big one that modern psychologists really look at is falsifiability. Is it able to be tested and proved incorrect, right? Or find evidence against it. For some of the theories that we will study, this is a big part of how they were even defined. Other theories will be like, we don't care if it's falsifiable, and in fact, there's almost no way to falsify it based on the way it's constructed. So again, something else we can look at throughout the semester. And then there's empirical validity. We'll discuss this more when we cover research. But basically, this is the theory applicable? So if I try to use the theory to predict something about someone, would that actually make a good prediction? So for example, in psychology, we often want to make predictions about things in our research, but also in applied psychology, right? If I am a clinician and someone comes to me and says they're thinking about harming themselves, I need to have a good way to predict whether it's safe to let them go home or whether I need to keep them in my office, perhaps hospitalize them, right? So that becomes very important in psychology. And then utility. Is it actually useful? Is it describing, trying to explain something that we actually care about trying to explain? Or is it sort of so niche that, in fact, it's not helpful? So other ways of looking at it, I referenced this on Monday, Funder's first law. So a theory's greatest strength is usually also its greatest weakness. A theory's greatest strength is usually also its greatest weakness. So we need to keep that in mind throughout the semester. And really, this is something I keep in mind, like, throughout any type of evaluation I do for any material. Now, I will reference this to people who have, like, never heard of Funder. It was just be like, Funder's first law, and they'll just kind of look at me like, a theory's greatest strength, this is also usually its greatest weakness. So, you know, if your great strength is you're trying to explain everything about the human condition, that's also going to be a weakness because it'll probably mean there's some holes in your theory, right? If your theory's strength is that it's really strong at explaining one relationship, then your weakness is you're leaving out everything else, right? So that becomes very important. Newberry had really good ways of thinking about how to critique theories as well. So he said, we need to think about formal clarity. We need to think about what the theory really says. We have to be able to tell what the theory is saying. Is it actually saying something that makes sense? Is it written unambiguously, or is it pretty vague? So that becomes really important. Successful post-diction just means the theory has to account for what we already know. So if there's a theory that comes out, let's examine in physics, and it just discounts gravity, probably not going to be a great theory, right? Because you need to take that into account as you make calculations. Same thing in psychology. If it just ignores what we already know, it's probably not going to be a great theory. It also has to account for data that already exists. And then we have to be able to use the scientific method to test the theory. And this goes back to empirical validity and also it being falsifiable, right? This is just a way of sort of condensing those. So what happens in science is that you have your theory, right? And then that's going to lead to a specific hypothesis that you'll test in a study. And you come up with ways of testing it. And those ways could be, I'm going to give someone a survey, to I'm going to have someone, come into the lab and I'm going to manipulate them to cluck like a chicken. I don't know. You gotta think about the ethics of it too, obviously. But so that could be a piece of it. So you get data and then you see, does it support your hypothesis or not? If it does, great. You try to disseminate that. If it doesn't, you might need to go back and think about your hypothesis and can you be more precise with that. If over and over and over you're finding all your hypotheses based on a single theory are just not being supported, maybe you need to go back and revise that theory. Okay, so that's the scientific method. That's what we use in psychology, and that is what ends up determining these things. And then a theory, this is something so important that I think gets missed in our lay vernacular. A theory is never actually proven. Okay? People are like, oh, yep, I proved that with one study. In science, all you can say is that there's data supporting a theory, or you fail to disprove the theory. In science, we never say like, yep, I just proved it. And in fact, if any of you take classes with Dr. Martorell, this is one of her pet peeves, so don't ever use the language like, yeah, I proved this, because you'll get points off, for sure. Essentially, it can be disconfirmed, is the way we're thinking about it. And this relates back to Funder's first law. A theory should have within it the seeds of its own destruction. If there's no way to disconfirm it, it's somewhat meaningless. So if it's not refutable, it's technically not science. It's something, right? But it's not science. So the scientific method becomes very, very important. So we'll actually spend a few days talking about how we do research in the area of personality. As you can imagine, that's very, very tricky. And then we'll kind of keep coming back to the idea of science throughout the semester. And then parsimony. Newberry also likes the idea of parsimony. Simplicity. This is a goal, he said, but psychological theories rarely reach this stage. Again, because we have to account for human thought and emotion and behavior, which is pretty complex. So what makes a good theory? We have lots of different ways to evaluate it. And in some ways, sometimes what it comes down to is sort of what we want to study and what our data is backing up. So if all this is so complicated, why the heck do we need theories? So Levine and Newberry each gave us different explanations for this, but I took their respective classes, so I'll walk through each. So Levine says theories are simplifying. They try to reduce all the complexity down to something that makes sense. They also are explanatory. Theories try to explain things. They try to explain observed facts that we see in our society, and essentially, why is that happening that way? Why do people act this way? Why do people react this way? Theories are predictive. So they generate new relationships or new ideas about the relationships between constructs or between people or between sort of a person's mind and how they actually act. And then theories are heuristic. They stimulate curiosity and investigation. And I think that this is, again, the one that ties the most to the idea of the scientific method. The idea that, like, the idea is out there. We want to try to explain it. We want to try to describe it. We want to try to figure out if it's right or not, right? So that becomes really important because that's how we get science done. So then Newberry had his own, and as you can see, some of them do overlap with Levine's. So he said, theories summarize. You can take a room full of data and it can become a simple statement. And that used to be literal. So I remember my grad advisor telling me that when she did her stats for her dissertation, it was back when a computer was an entire room. You had punch cards that programmed the computer. And she said she kept like an extra set of her punch cards in her freezer to protect them, like Indiana Jones and the fourth Indiana Jones, maybe if there's a nuclear blast, mostly for fire. But yeah, so that used to be literal, right? And now sometimes it's more figurative, everything of taking up space on the cloud. Predictions. The ability of a theory to make good predictions can have profound consequences, even for things we haven't seen yet. And we're certainly seeing this happen in the areas of biology and physics, for example, chemistry. So a few years ago, they found evidence of gravitational waves. And there was a great viral video where the person who found the evidence went to the person who had theorized it and told him, and he and his wife had worked on it together, and both of them got like emotional about it. So these can be really powerful things that speak of things we don't even have the capacity to prove yet, right? Like I always sort of joke that it would be great if I didn't have to give you all tests, if I just had like a scanner and I could scan you and be like, yep, you got all the knowledge you need to know. Maybe we'll be there in the future. I don't know, it might be too scary, right? But maybe we'll be there. The other thing theories can provide is a sense of closure. So you feel like you understand, you feel like it's comprehensive. So essentially a theory is an explanation. And we as humans really often want to know why, right? We want things explained. We don't like when we don't know why things are. Or if we do, we like try to sort of have fun with it, right? I always think of the Ancient Aliens guy, like we can't explain the aliens, right? So we try to find answers for things. So the goals of science are to predict, control, and explain. Predict, control, and explain natural phenomena. For psychology, again, there are things we want to predict, like how well will someone do in therapy? If I give them this treatment, will it actually help, right? There are things we want to control. We want to control the behavior of people who have the trait that we call psychopathy. People who are psychopaths or have psychopathic tendencies, right? We don't want them out there being serial killers or being the people on Wall Street who made the housing bubble burst, right? So we have to think about how we control things like that. We don't have a good answer for that for psychopathy yet, by the way. That's something we're still working on. And then explain. Again, we as humans want to know why. So explanation becomes really super important for things. And again, this is especially important in the applied fields of psychology, if you're working with clients, employees, things along those lines. But it's also really important in what we call the basic science side of psychology, where we're trying to do sort of the digging, the labor in the trenches to apply to those areas where you are working with the public. And it's not just people. That's something else I should say. Like psychology also looks at how do we explain things in animals, and we're discovering that especially animals with higher order thinking have personalities as well. And anyone who's had a pet kind of knows that, right? So before we had Simba, our ornament of a cat, we had a adorable but 6-pound cat who was like sort of aloof, would never sit on your lap, would sit like next to you if she like sort of like allowed you to be in her presence, right? And Simba will just like crawl all over you, right? Cats, like people, have different personalities. Another important thing to think about as we go through this class is that we are all theorists. People are naturally inclined to assess or get to know each other. People look for non-random regularities in attitudes and behaviors, and they make judgments based on these observations. And as we know, those judgments are not necessarily always accurate, right? So people come up with their own theories about why other people act the way they do and how they came to be that way. So this is often referred to as the fundamental attribution error. So this is the idea, the belief that any error I make is due to the situation, due to what's going on around me. But an error someone else makes is because of their personality. So the example I always give of this is clumsiness, just because it's not really a personality trait, it's something pretty easy to understand. So if I trip over, say, my office chair, which I can't really move out of the way, right? I might just be like, oh, my office chair was in the way. But if I see someone else trip, I might be like, oh, what a clumsy person. That's the fundamental attribution error, right? You could, again, take this to a psychological concept. I've had a really crummy morning. Those of you who were on early, I was telling you that my car wouldn't start when I got in it to take my daughter to daycare. So I've already had AAA at my house and like had a neighbor drive me to work in the middle of a pandemic, going to school rather. So definitely a challenge, right? And so I was sort of anxious about all that. And, I knew it was because of my situation. But if I saw someone else who was sort of like pacing and freaking out, right, and I didn't know what was going on with them, I might be like, ooh, that person has some mental health issues, like, pacing around, I don't know, right? So that's the fundamental attribution error, that what's happening to me is because of the situation, what's happening to someone else is because something's wrong with them, right? So we're judgy. People are judgy. And we do this not maliciously, but because it's easier for us to process than trying to figure out what's going on in that person's life. And obviously with people we're closer to, we take the time to do this, right? We take the time to figure out, hey, what's wrong? What's going on? How can I help you? And so then what we have to realize is that humans are prone to jump or sometimes even leap to conclusions, right? So they assume that someone's behavior, which again, they might only see sort of like one moment of their day, reflects on their personality. In actuality, personality is really the result of the interaction between the person and the situation that they're in, right? So like, if my day had gone as I thought it would and my car started no problem and I got Quinn to school and we were good to go, I wouldn't have been pacing and anxious and making frantic calls to everyone I could think of and bugging my neighbor to drive us, right? But again, we don't always take the time to realize that. Actually, when I took a social psychology class in grad school, our textbook was even called The Person and the Situation, kind of recognizing these two important bits together. The idea is by seeing people across different settings and contexts, we get a better idea of their personality. And particularly when we get to talking about trait theory, for example, we'll talk a lot about sort of the definition of a trait is that it carries over to different situations. However, there are times we don't want people's behavior to be identical, right? So the classic example I always give to this, and I know y'all aren't supposed to have parties now, so it's less applicable, right? But if you went to a party when it was safe to do so, right? And you walked in and you got out your pen and you sat down and started taking notes and raised your hand, people look at you like you're nuts, right? But if you did the exact same behaviors when you walk into one of your in-person classes on campus, right, everyone would expect you to. On the same token, if you started dancing on the table in the middle of one of your in-person classes, right, people would be like, you okay? Right? But if you're doing that at a party at 2 a.m., most people aren't going to say peep, right? So that is something really important to think about as we go forward in this class, as we think about personality, is how much of it carries over from situation to situation and how much flexibility is there, right? So some people say personality is something that is just solid through your entire life, does not change, right? Other people say, like, look, big events are going to happen to you, right? And they don't have to be bad. It could be, you fall in love, you get a new dog who ends up being sort of a therapy dog for you, right? And you change. But there are some people who argue like, well, then that wasn't personality. So again, this class can be frustrating, I think, at times for people because of that, because there is no one answer for things. But on the other hand, this class is really exciting because we get the chance to sort of start figuring these things out. So I am going to stop screen sharing here and see if anyone has any questions about anything I went over today. Yeah, I think I did it a little quicker than I usually would, just because it's like a little harder to get feedback from you all. I will work on that myself. I'm having you all on the screen, so that's really helping, and I will play with that. So let me pull up the syllabus just to make sure I'm on the same page with you all, because I teach 3 of my 4 classes today. So I'm always sort of like, who's going what, where? And make sure I can give you a roadmap for what is coming up here. Alrighty, so for Friday, if you have your book, go ahead and read chapter 2. If you're just getting it, make sure you go back and read chapter 1, too, because Funder says some things differently than I do. And we're gonna start talking about research methods. So we'll spend a couple days talking about that, and then we'll have our first discussion day related to that on Wednesday. So by Wednesday, you for sure need the Pieces book so that you can refer to it during our in-class discussions. So try to get that. If you know someone else who has it on campus, you can like sanitize it and borrow theirs. So it's got to be safe ways to do it. And let me know if, you know, it really becomes a problem. I know for my women's and gender studies class, I actually scanned the first set of readings in for them since the bookstore's behind. So. All right, well, I will let you all go, and I'll stick around on Zoom for a couple minutes in case anyone has individual questions, and I will see you on Friday.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Dr. Myers.
Yes.
Did you already add me for the Blackboard on your
I
board?
don't think I did. I will go check that right now, and if not, I will add you.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for reminding me.
Of course. Have a great day.
Thank you.
I have a question about the book. So we're reading off the personality puzzle. What about the pieces of the personality puzzle?
The pieces of the personality puzzle is what you'll need for starting next Wednesday. So when you look on the syllabus and it says just like an author name, those are readings by that author in the personality puzzle one, and the pieces book.
Oh, okay. All right, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, yeah, I have a quick question too, because I know last class you said you wanted us to set up like appointments or like so that we could talk to you like one-on-one, and I was trying to find it and I couldn't find where like to set up like an appointment was. Where can I find that?
Sure, so it's on the top of the syllabus.
Mhm.
Do that, or I'll just stick it in the chat for you too.
Okay, thank you.
There you go. So if you just copy paste that into your browser, then it'll take you to where you can set up either a Google Meet or a Zoom meeting with me.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.